It's a common creationist misconception that the theory of evolution states that one kind of animal changed into a different kind of animal.
I got three problems with what he says there.
A horse is a horse, of course, and the way you talk to a horse, of course, that is a horse, unless the horse is the famous Mr. A.
It's a common creationist misconception that the theory of evolution states that one kind of animal changed into a different kind of animal. According to the theory of evolution, humans will always produce humans and dogs will always produce dogs. But they would always still be what their ancestors were, like us. We are still hominids, we're still primates, mammals, tetrapods. Chickens are still dinosaurs. They've just become something more as their ancestors moved out into new environments.
Well, um, so there's two things here in this particular short that was by Michael Jones. Okay, first of all, some background a little bit. Michael Jones is a theistic evolutionist, and so he believes in that evolution happened, but it started by God and possibly, I don't know, some theistic evolutionists do this, some don't, but he might believe that God guided the process. But either way, he definitely thinks that God initiated the process, and from there it became kind of a naturalistic occurrence that all life. I don't know if he thinks all life evolved, but he seems to have some confusion on categories on what classifies as a kind. I don't think he understands the distinction there. Um, or he's coming up with his own classification of kinds, which is not the same as either evolutionists or ours. But there's two things here. Okay, one, he's essentially accusing us of a straw man. I'm gonna come more back to this in a little bit. Back to the straw man that he's accusing us of, and we'll see if we actually are misrepresenting evolution or not. I got some quotes along those lines from Charles Darwin himself, but we'll get to there in a little bit. The second thing he's accusing us of, or second thing he's saying, is that kinds are that they are evolving within a kind, but the kind is these major classifications of creatures. But he says they're within that same category, the same kind, and that's actually what he ends the short with as well. Essentially, he sees human beings being in the same kind of ape, ape kind, and we're still primates, and he sees chickens as dinosaurs, and along those lines, I got three problems with what he says there. Okay, first of all, let me explain something. There are minor variations that can happen within a kind, disagreed by everybody. Now, he's obviously making what a lot of evolution do. They equivocate on the word evolution because evolution is change. But the issue is not over whether things change, because everybody agrees that things change. And everybody agrees that organisms change over time. Everyone agrees with that. We agree with speciation, we agree with variations within a kind, and of course, evolutionists will usually call these minor variations evolution, because they think these variations ultimately over time become the more major classifications of creatures that we now experience today and so forth. And which they call macroevolution. But what they call microevolution is not actually evolution at all. It's minor variations within a kind, no new information is being added. Darwin saw this process as limitless. That include, as you see from some of the quotes here in a minute, that it would include all animals on Earth, all of them. And it seems, at least verbally, it seems like Michael Jones is conceding that these changes have limits, but he's classifying these limits within a very broad category, which he's claiming is part of the same narrow category, but is not part of the same narrow category. And so I usually tell people like this when I talk to evolutionists, I would say, okay, imagine this. Evolution, what evolution actually claims is what I call horizontal changes. what we actually observe, what we actually agree with, is what's called vertical changes. And it is true, through these vertical changes, you can get different species and different variety of animals. Absolutely. But that's not the same as these major classifications of animals. Because in the case of these major classification animals, you have to come up with new body plans, new genetics, new genetic information within it, and no natural processes have ever given risen to new information. And so the problem is trying to get these minor variations to ultimately become these major classifications of animals. And of course, evolutionists, they think that they assume in a circle that these minor variations become ultimately, with enough time, as we'll see, Charles Darwin said that, with enough time, I think that it will ultimately become all these major classifications of animals. In which case, you would have to have new body plans and new additional genetic information added to it, added to the genome, and so forth. And so basically, they want to go from what we observe, which are minor variations within a kind that everyone agrees on, to what we don't observe with these major classifications. What Michael Jones has done is he's taken these, what is actually considered a theory of evolution, the horizontal changes, and he's trying to turn it on its head to make it look like it's the same as these vertical changes that we do observe, and it's not. And what we don't observe is these horizontal changes. We do observe these minor variations within a kind. Now, with that said, is a chicken a dinosaur? Is humans apes? We'll get into that in a little bit, but I have three problems. Okay, three problems with what he said on chicken is a dinosaur and this confusion of kinds here. Okay, the first problem, and of course, I have a biblical problem as well, because I understand that that's not the biblical definition of what we say it's kinds, and what young it's creationists. When we attack evolution and we talk about kinds, it's not his definition of kinds. Okay, our definition of kinds fits well with the law of identity and physiological. It's not arbitrary, and so forth. We'll get into that here in a minute. But the first problem I have is it's the violation of the law of identity. Okay, the law of identity, simply put, says that something is what it is and it's not what it's not. I know that's very simplistic, but it's basically essential to the law of identity. In logical form, it's A, but not B. So it is a chair is a chair by definition. It has the shape of a chair, it has similar composition of a chair. You sit on it, it's designed for one person to sit on it at a given time. It's not a couch. A couch has a completely different definition. It has different shape. It has for the most part, it has different composition. It has different designs for it. A lot of times, it can sit multiple people. Things that the chair can't do, because you can't really sit multiple people in chairs. You have someone sit in your lap, but then they're not sitting in the chair. But you can't have multiple people sitting at the same chair at the same time like that, like you can a couch. Would it be right, logically, for me to just call this chair a couch? So yes, it has all the earmarks of a chair. Yes, it has all the right elements of a chair. Yes, it fits the shape of a chair. It has all the components of a chairness to it. But I'm going to just go ahead and call it a couch. I'm going to say it's part of the family of couch. I'm going to just label it as a couch. No reason, no rhyme or reason why I'm calling it a couch. I'm just going to label it that way. That would not be rational, because it's a chair. It's not a couch. By definition, it would not be a couch. And so that's the law of identity. A chicken is a chicken. It's not a dinosaur. And it's obvious that it's a chicken, because the physiological is different. The genetic information inside a chicken is different. If it had the genetic information of a dinosaur, then it would look like a dinosaur. That's just genetics 101, common sense 101, And this leads me to the second problem that I have with what he has to say, is that it renders the distinction between kinds as arbitrary. Arbitrary is just a fancy word that means without reason, without any basis for it. It's just a label he's applying, rather than because he has reason to apply that label. When biblical creationists talk about kinds, we have a basis for it, not just because it's in the Bible and so forth, but that too, but also because we have a actual basis for why we would classify one kind as being distinct from another kind, such as differences in physiology. Um, uh, uh, we can even throw in genetics into that, whether it can interbreed with it. Of course, some of them, like the fox, has gotten out of their ability to interbreed with other people of its kind because of mutations and so forth over time. It's lost too much of its genetics, and its chromosome counts now are compatible with that of the dog kind. But that happened as a result of loss of information, ironically. But anyway, I won't be covering that in this video. But any given case, um, uh, we have an actual reason or basis for why we would distinguish this kind from that kind. If you're sitting there just labeling chicken as a dinosaur, with no reason at all, no physiological reason, no genetic reason, nothing, just labeling it, then the distinction between the different kinds is arbitrary. And which leads me to the third reason. The third problem I have with it is that it's circular. The argument, just like the evolutionary arguments on that, because assuming that microevolution turns into macroevolution, it's circular. You have to assume that the chicken evolved from a dinosaur, ultimately, which is the very thing you haven't yet demonstrated. So yeah, so those are the three problems that I would have with that. But anyway, what about this charge of accusation? About this charge of accusation, he accused us of straw manning the theory of evolution. Now, the word evolution can be kind of an umbrella term that's often used by evolutionists. And most of the time, when people use the word evolution, what they mean is either the theory of evolution or the process alleged from evolution that's the result of what the theory of evolution claims is supposed to happen and still happen. That's ultimately what they mean by it. And of course, there are all different kinds of evolutionists. You got neo-Darwinism, which most evolutionists and most atheists are neo-Darwinists. There are some that are just Darwinists, but most of them are neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism adds genetics, mutation, and abiogenesis. They're the ones who add all that stuff in there. Theistic evolutionists, most of them would reject neo-Darwinism while accept Darwinian evolution in its most basic form, but then some might try to reject what evolutionists typically call macroevolution. On the surface, it looks like Michael might be rejecting macroevolution because of the way in which he's wording things, but then he classifies things as he's taking other kinds and saying, yes, this kind evolved into that kind, but he's claiming that these are not actually two separate kinds, that they're the same kind, when in reality they are separate kinds. So it's the way he's classifying things and labeling things, it's just artificial. It's just not the way it is. And there's no, like I said, there's no rhyme or reason for it. But okay, taking the context, the way Michael said this, it almost sounds like he's saying that we don't understand the process of evolution, and that seems to assume the theory of evolution as it is made by Charles Darwin, which I have Charles Darwin's books right here. Here's The Origin of Species. Originally, it was called On the Origin of Species. They renamed it later on down the road. And Descent of Man, the quotes that I'm going to be quoting is from Descent of Man. This is where he gets his most known arguments about alleged human evolution and so forth. And so we're going to get to those quotes and see if creationists are strawmanning evolutionists. All right. He who wishes to decide, this is Charles Darwin speaking. I got two quotes from Charles Darwin. This is the first of the two. He who wishes to decide whether man is the modified descendant of some pre-existing form would probably first inquire whether man varies higher or slightly in body structure and in mental faculties, and if so, whether the variations are transmitted to his offspring in accordance with the laws which prevail with the lowest animals. Again, are the variations the result, as far as our ignorance permits us to judge, of the same general causes? And are they governed by the same general laws as in the case of other organisms? For instance, by correlation, the inherent effects of use and disuse, etc., is man subject to similar malconformations, the result of arrested development of reduplications of parts, etc. Does he display in any of his anomalies reversions of some former and ancient type of structure? It might also naturally be inquired whether man, like so many other animals, has given rise to varieties and subraces differing but slightly from each other, or to races differing so much that they must be classified as doubtful species. Charles Darwin, The Descent of Man, page 7. Let's look at the next quote. This is a most perplexing subject, Charles Darwin said. It cannot be denied that changed conditions produce some and occasionally a considerable effect on organisms of all kinds, and it seems at first probable that if sufficient time were allowed, this would be the invariable result. But I have failed to obtain clear evidence in favor of this conclusion. This says "dog" written all over it, and they still don't have any evidence for it. And valid reasons may be urged on the other side, at least as the innumerable structures are concerned, which are adopted for species in. There can, however, be no doubt that changed conditions induce an almost indefinite amount of fluctuations, variability, by which the whole organization is rendered in some degree plastic. Charles Darwin, Descent of Man, page 22. He makes it clear he didn't think that there was any limitations to this. And most evolutionists are neo-Darwinists, and most evolutionists take this position that the changes are unlimited. So we're not strawmanning evolutionists. I just wonder whether or not Michael Jones really understands the very theory he's promoting and supporting. But any given case, what about this thing about man and ape evolution? He said that we're the same, we're still primates. Are we still primates? Are we primates at all? I want to quote somebody. This will be the third quote, but it won't be from Charles Darwin. It'll be from someone named John Morrison. All right. John Morrison said, the human genome contains 6 billion base pairs, ATGC. So those 46 chromosomes contain 6 billion base pairs inside of them. A random change of just 3 base pairs, 0.00000000005%, is fatal. The lowest estimated difference between the DNA of apes and that of humans is 50 million base pairs. 50 million. Yet a change of just 3 of these base pairs is fatal. Unlike Darwin, we now have a much better understanding of how DNA works, and with this understanding, evolution starts looking more and more like a philosophical dream and less like science. John Morrison, Evolution's Final Days, The Mounting Evidence Disproving the Theory of Evolution, 2020, pages 67 through 68. And by the way, what John Moore says is actually based on an actual study that was done, an actual research in human genome, where they actually mapped out, or they were attempting to map out the human genome, in which case, in the process, they discovered that you cannot get ape genetics too close to human genetics. If it gets too close to it, in terms of genetics, even if it's just a little bit closer than what it already is, it would cease, it would not be able to survive. It would literally die. It was fatal. So you can't get it close at all. We're not primates. Human beings are clearly different from apes. Apes are completely different physiological. They got longer arms than we do. Apes are super strong. Their skin is different. If you felt the texture of an ape skin, it's much different than our texture of our skin. There's they have fur instead of hair. I mean, as far as apes go, they're much bigger than humans in terms of broadness. Even though they can walk on 2 legs, they usually walk on all fours and things like that. In humans, you could tell that we're physiological difference. You put ape genetics up against human genetics, you could tell the difference. And he said there was 50 million or 50 Yeah, I think it was 50, it was either 50 million or 50 billion base pairs. I think it was 50 million base pairs. That's a lot of base pairs. There's much more significant difference genetically than most people even realize. I mean, we're more than our genetics, obviously, but there's uh, uh, um, uh, a much more significant difference between us and apes. We're not primates at all. We don't have no physiological characteristics at all. This again appears to be arbitrary and circular. And by the way, the fact that it's a circular argument might explain why it's arbitrary, because that's what a vicious circle obviously has an arbitrary conclusion. Technically, a conclusion of circular argument is technically valid because it's the reinstatement of the premise. Premise and conclusion are just reinstatements of each other. But so of course the conclusion is going to follow from the premise. But the fact of the matter is that the conclusion itself is rendered arbitrary because it doesn't actually prove the thing in question because you only assume it. So yeah. So are we strawmanning them? No. And a chicken is not a dinosaur. No. He's got a totally, completely confused look on what actually counts as kinds. All right. Obviously, a chicken is not a dinosaur. You know, a duck. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and looks like a duck, it's probably a duck, not a dinosaur. You know, and a horse is a horse, of course, unless of course you're the famous Michael Jones.